Hello everyone, today we talk about military clothing supplies in the 6th century Roman Empire. We will make other videos specifically dedicated to Roman clothing, but today we focus on this aspect of the production and supplying of the same military clothing in roughly, in the 6th century, in the Justinian times, and which is a period that is, let's say, not dramatically documented as we know, but it's normal for the time. Essentially, it's this last great, florid phase of late antique civilization that eventually will decline, starting from the same mid 6th century, because of because of the plague, because of the economical demographic crisis and everything. And it's a time in which, however, you start already see that things have changed from before. And this is a fascinating topic actually, because many people think that the Roman Empire was just a state that essentially centralized everything, especially in the late Roman times, where objectively there was an increase in the interference of the state in matters of production and their organization. And it is true, from the crisis of the 3rd century, that had also entailed, in fact, a demographic crisis for recruitment. It's as if the empire had shrunk more consistently to around the Mediterranean areas that were the most populated, the most fertile, but also the frontiers had become more turbulent. And actually, because of the same Roman military revolts, for example, that had brought the fabricae at that time. We can call it this way, the fabricae, if you prefer an ecclesiastical pronunciation, to fall in the hands either of these rebels, usurpers, or the barbarians, right? So there is this great reshaping that takes place very gradually, very progressively, that, however, structures and strengthens the Roman administrative structures, creates this bureaucracy that objectively in previous times didn't quite exist as such. The Roman government had been pretty light in the statal machinery. The same military system had seemingly inflated. There is in terms of numbers, there is a huge debate about this, what this actually meant. More people went to the army, or, actually that there was a more militarized population. But we do know overall that the costs, and especially the tax pressure over the population, increased. And great part of this had to do, in fact, with the army itself, right? The greatest expanse of the empire, like any other polity of the time, was overwhelmingly the military. Right, because these empires worked essentially like this. It was about the control of an empire. The same essence of the empire was represented by the military deterrence that the army posed as such. Right, so it's not that there was these administrative structures were so terribly advanced or sophisticated. Actually, tax pressure was, compared to ours, in proportion, kind of numerically speaking, just lower, right? But these were naturally systems that produced much less with much greater difficulty, and therefore even a slight taxation of 1 point percentage was a massive blow sometimes to the local production, and so on. But as you know, the empire develops also as towards a more markedly and openly monarchic form that even entails, at this point, the infrastructures start to become really important. There are less people, armies become, in fact, smaller. Therefore, even massive, fortifications or even palaces as such become really great centers of production and stocking of material, of weaponry and armor, etc. And this starts occurring at a point that there is an increase, in fact, in the amount of equipment that the state is capable of providing directly to the army. This is also a great vexata quaestio, we can say, because we think, some people think, at least assume, that from Marian times everything was paid by the state. Well, technically it was so, right? But the problem is how this material was actually delivered is a bit different. We know also historically that yeah, there was an weaponry production, because at the end of the day, what made the difference between, in terms of military deterrence, was being armed in the first place. The difference between a civilian and a military man was not much in essence, but the fact that they were actually armed. The military men were actually armed, and that made a difference that was even visible. Just that person bears arms, that's a soldier, right? And that's also why even the problem of uniforming, or of further, homogenization from a military point of view was relative, right? And for a long time, actually, the Roman legionnaires kept producing weaponry on their own, right? I still think that the amount of weaponry and armament in general that the state owned since the late Republic was overwhelming, right? But locally speaking, we know there were fabricated in locally speaking, and that legionnaires produced, but sometimes even just purchased their own weaponry. Sometimes even the uniforms that technically existed, like we think the uniform is invented like by the Swedes in the mid 17th century because of the increase of centralization. Yeah, but that's at which height you place kind of the stick on this level. Like since ever, like there have been units that have worn, I don't know, the same color, right? I think the Roman army didn't have, actually, the army was so expansive that there wasn't much of a need for doing it. Actually, the Romans probably uniformed certain units, possibly cohorts, were generally speaking the even more than the legion, the unit to which you kind of felt yourself more attached to in terms of esprit de corps, we can say. There were even other subdivisions, and those were probably uniformed in some way, in some terms of colors, etc. But this was, I presume, left mostly to locals, right? We know of orders of clothing and of other equipment that was issued, etc. But even, I don't know, for the tunics, etc., they just bought a cloth of a certain color, then maybe the legionnaire just sewed it in a fashion it would turn out into a tunic, right? And that was essentially the part of the fort that the state made, and the one the soldier himself made, respectively. And the soldier technically could buy whatever he liked, because in part, like, the equipment he received, especially weaponry, could be reused over time, since fairly late time had to be in part recompensated to the military administration, like if you lost it or you broke it in some way, aside from combat, I presume, had to be actually reimbursed by the legionnaire to the military administration. But let's say that they also received a salary proper with which they could even buy other stuff. So actually, I discussed this in a video that I don't remember what, on the I don't know, the colors of Roman Legion. I don't remember, actually. If you go in the Roman Warfare playlist, you should find it. There are some yellow, legionaries with yellow scuta, for example, that's easy to recognize visually. But over time, there was an increased monopolium of the state, really, over the weaponry distribution. And at this point, in fact, in the 6th century, things had remained conceptually in the same way. For what concerns that there was a part of this that was, paid by the state, another part that was essentially provided by others. And the reason being that by the 6th century, actually, there were certain magnates. You can't look, essentially there were local lords, especially in the interland regions of the empires, on the frontiers, and these great estates of landowners that could afford actually a lot by themselves because they already owned and managed it, and that was not statal property. Technically, the empire owned everything, right? But there is this phenomenon that will eventually increase in the history of the let's say of Europe in general, not just in the eastern, half of the empire. Actually, this existed also in the west, as we will see partly later on. I mean, this increase of autonomization, decentralization, even in what concerns the actual military organization. Think about the Bucellari, for example. That these were effectively magnates that paid their own troops, their own private troops, that eventually did participate to the imperial army, but that were raised and equipped, in fact, by these lords that at this point, however, weren't just like levying troops, random troops from even people just didn't want to come. These people were creating kind of their own small seigneury around, so they had, for example, just a corps of troops that was usually, already used to fight, or maybe were even veterans. Now we will have to dedicate a video to that, specifically speaking. But you understand at that point that the ways these troops were equipped were different. And for example, they're different in the sense that in the modalities, right? Not in the actual equipment. That naturally could vary, but the essence of it remained essentially the same for the technical potential of the time. There is also another shift that had already occurred since the 3rd century, that is these increase in natural compensations, the famous this fact that the troops were paid with wheat, for example, not just with money, because money were getting relatively rarer, and especially the economy of the middle classes was vanishing from previous times, and it was just only the aristocrats with the heavy golden money that at this point really made a difference. So there is actually this greater organization from the top, which is important when you have to consider even certain political and social changes that the empire underwent at this point. So what I'm trying to say here, I guess, is that the statal centralization was loosening itself, and this would be evident with later problems with revolts, with usurpations, and the general crisis that the empire was undergoing, not just because of the massive demographic and economical crisis that some want to recite, but it did exist. But naturally that explains also, for example, why at the beginning of the 7th century the Arabs had it so easy to take over certain regions of the empire. So there are a lot of connections that could be done. But what we can say here about the equipment properties, that actually the clothing, because we're talking about the clothing, is that the military clothing was generally, but not mandatorily, this is the point, provided by the state, right? While the soldiers received specific indemnity in order to buy it. So you see what's the point here, that as we will see, it was chiefly recruits who were more directly kept by the empire. Why? You wonder why? Well, it's easy, because these were the larger amount of the population. These governments tended to disarm the population. The Roman Empire had worked for centuries actually relying on, especially for police and local order, with the local militias, right? If, I don't know, Caesar had conquered a certain Gallic oppidum that had its own, armed men that also performed their police duties, etc. The majority of the weapons, etc., were confiscated by the Romans, but these militias, these forms of autonomous self-regulations, were out there. Sometimes they were levied, right? There were entire communities, especially big cities, and here especially in the eastern part of the empire, that those were still pretty alive. But you can see it even, in fact, in Roman Gaul, still at the end of the Western Roman Empire, that there was a lot of autonomy in the ways the same empire had been working. Because let's be honest about this, the Roman Empire had always been ruled by the elites, locally speaking. Like, what are all these magistrates? What was the deal of all the munera of the magistrates? Well, it's simply that they were given, they subcontracted all the management of the cities, So it was a big business, a big investment. They received this office and they ran the city to make money. That's also why a reason why, for example, cities at a certain point declined during this later Roman Empire, not because much of commitment of the magistrates to the ancient morals and all this alleged moral decadence, etc., but simply because it was way more convenient to run the country villas and latifundia than staying in cities that were, by the way, usually targeted by barbarian raids, etc. And it was but not only, right? There is a broader economical reason for the decline of the city instead of the rising importance of the countryside. It also suffered its own blows, but especially in certain areas of Europe that are not typically the eastern ones, but also, right, especially in the hinterland, like in the Balkans, in and the Anatolian plateau, etc., also experienced this kind of autonomizations, right? So this kept going on, also because the local communities were used to defend themselves. Think about the Limitani, right? What did all the Limitani end like? These people had become essentially local militias that in certain cases remained even in, the Romano-Germanic kingdoms in the same ways, sometimes with the same equipment and the same commitment, because those were aimed also at defending places. They were not just stationed from some part, but they simply lived in, so they had their families there. They were committed to defend it, and so on. So the soldiers instead were already paid. Like this is also a great administrative simplification. If you give a soldier the money to equip himself, because he will have to go to war with that anyway, and the war he makes is not much of an imposition, but at this point there is actually kind of a class of professional troopers, right? Think about the perpetua sanctio of the late Roman Empire, that you had basically to have your same father's job. So if your father had been a professional militaryman, you had to be. If your father was a peasant, you had to be a peasant. That's how society had crystallized, right? So those people were not called, just for, as an imposition. The military of the empire, the professional one, was effectively the one that had all the interests also in those same military campaigns and expeditions that the empire mounted up, because they were the same people who ran the empire, right? And they therefore the state could count on the fact they would arm themselves, always given that they were paid for this reason. But at least the state didn't have to pay for all the to provide for all the soldiers' equipment. Right, they already had the means to resupply it without centralizing a massive production, which, however, did exist, right, in part. The state had to preserve. Here, especially the Eastern Roman Empire had this pretty fair balance between that, did work for a long time between the public, like for the state, the empire that was becoming essentially the imperial household, and it's more for like longer, shorter reach administration, and the provincial private aristocracies, right? And it was fairly well balanced. So it's as if there were in parallel two different armies. It would evolve like that towards the 9th century, with the creation even of a, strictly speaking, imperial household military and provincial armies that had eventually evolved into something else. Well, this is where it began by a certain standard, right? And it did pass even through this differentiation. And by the way, all the sources basically we use here are the Justinian Code, right? This is the major source on this forms of production and supplying, because they're simply the imperial dispositions about this activities. So that's substantially it. So there was a law in the Justinian Code 1239 that established that 5/6 of a specific tax were destined to the comes largitionem, which in Latin is the account of the, the distribution, we could say. This names you see here, for example, the state still has Latin as the official language of the administration. Eventually, these charges in the Byzantine Empire would evolve, would change name for things that were, different from the original purpose. But this had to do specifically, in fact, with the distribution, with the pay of the soldiers, right? And specifically at this point of the indemnity for paying for their own equipment, right? While the rest, and this is interesting because it gives you the dimension, the first one of the 5/6 of specific tax were destined to these professional militarymen. The other sixth was instead paid to the so-called ginecea in order to pay for the clothing of the recruits, right? So you understand here there is a massive imbalance, telling the truth, at least in terms of clothing supplies, because evidently the levies, the recruits, were somewhat more rarely employed, right? Or at least as troops of similar levels were already available by themselves, presumably by certain forms of local militias, etc. The 5/6 of the specific tax that the empire levied to pay for military clothing was destined to the professional troopers, and more specifically not for producing it, like it happened instead for the ginecea, that now we will see what they are for the recruits, but they were essentially an indemnity for the soldiers to buy by themselves, to purchase by themselves their own clothing in this case. And the comes largitionem was the official that was in charge for it. Now the ginecea are disciplined in the code 11:8 and 2. 8:2, excuse me, that, and the ginecea were essentially the imperial fabric, right, for the production, however, specifically of the military clothing. There were also different other, areas, like, for example, there were the proper fabricae, actually, or fabric at this point. There were workshops for the arms proper. Then there were the buffia. There were instead the establishments for dyeing the clothes, right? The ginecea were the place for destined to weaving, right? And therefore had to provide the textiles for the army and also the court, telling the truth, all over the empire. And what is interesting is that the ginecea last up to, like, they're documented as many things in this kind of late antiquity phase, up to the 7th century crisis, right? So what we understand also from here is that at a certain point this more or less centralized establishments scattered all over the empire and used by the central administration were abandoned, right? And there was which say overlapped with further privatization of systems of levying the army itself, right? And sometimes, like, literally these establishments were seized, as we will see, by the same Arabs, right? But at this point we will see that there were also other ways to clothe troops, including, using the same clothes that were taken from the captured enemy camps, well, whatever. And we actually have a pretty large amount of these establishments. The Notitia Dignitatum, which is a bit of an earlier source, however, lists this 14 establishments, only for what concerns the western half of the empire. But it is to presume that, in fact, in the east, the establishments were much more numerous, and we will see some centers afterwards, for example, and well distributed on the territory, We actually know that there were great establishments in Egypt, at Alexandria, at Antinoe, and in Syria, at Laodicea and Tyrus, right? The Gymnasium of Tyrus especially was the most renowned for the silk textiles that were silk, at that point Tyrus is at the end of the Silk Road up to the Mediterranean, so silk was imported by the Far East at that point, and it reached Syria, the Mediterranean, and that's where essentially it was actually worked by the local imperial establishment. And close to this establishment in Tyrus had to be connected at least one bathium for the dyeing of the precious local purple, right, for which there was a rigid state monopoly, because that was destined, in fact, was first of all extremely expensive. This was actually since ancient history, the purple was by pulverizing these mollusks that eventually gave this red color. In fact, the same Phoenicians, for example, were known like this by the Greeks, phoinikoi, because it literally meant they're reds, because in Tyrus here from Phoenicia, where today's Lebanon, essentially from where they came from, they had since ancient times this local production, and that was very expensive. Very, very expensive. Purple was, very costly, was reserved for this reason to the commanders and the officers of higher rank. Like the purple was the symbol of the imperial dignity proper, right? And it was something, therefore, also that would grow symbolically to be. It was overloaded with meanings, even. Well, I can think many others are, many attached artistically and, religiously, anthropologically to this color as well. But let's say while other colors, like dyeing of other color, could be easily obtained with lesser expense through mineral and vegetal essences, such as the red, not the purple, but the red simple could be, for example, obtained by the roots of the mother, the rubia, the so-called rubia tinctorum, in fact. So the rubia of the dyers in Latin. So, Rolf, a word about the Ginecea proper, because this term, as you know, comes from the area where in ancient Greece the women gathered, this area of the oikos, where the women were actually relegated, and they used to weave traditionally. So hence the name of Ginecea. I actually think that these stadal establishments were actually not employing women in the work, even if I found this probably somewhere, but I found other scholars said no, probably there actually weren't, because I think these were militarized establishments. Essentially, they were like the Fabrica, but I have some reserve in this, in the sense that, especially if they were just producing clothes, right, they could hire really anyone, and it wouldn't be so strange actually for women in 6th century Eastern Mediterranean Hellenistic world, like to work in those conditions as well. And naturally, we have some evidence. For example, the Notitia Dignitatum mentions the procuratores Ginecei, so that were officers deputed to control these establishments in Gaul as well as in the East, and in the latter case especially without any precise localization. And Constantine I edict of 333 refers to the Ginecea and dyers' workshops as well. Eusebius of Caesarea considers workers in Ginecea, and in linen workshops the slaves of the Treasury. This is important because it shows that these were people who actually worked directly for the imperial household, or at least they were paid directly. They were employed, given they were slaves, forcibly by the central administration in this regard. So Zomenos later says that Ginecea were included among places such as mines and linen workshops to which people were sent to do forced labor, right? And this is particularly interesting because it tells that it was an intensive production. So there was a level of proto-industrial production in this centers, likely. But it's interesting, though, that these centers eventually declined at the point that the same term Gyneceum actually gets forgotten in the later centuries of Byzantine history. So that's quite interesting by itself. Then I don't know what else we could say now. Well, but talking about the clothing distribution proper, we have seen how there was a taxation specifically for the purchase of military garments, right? The so-called vestis militaris, so the military clothes, the military dress, and this was only one example of state provisions for the army's clothing, though. We have seen how there were the Fabricae recorded in the West, the Notitia Dignitatum, specifically for the Pars Occidentis 10:12 mentions tournée for the manufacture of the sagum. There was this famous kind of thick, heavy mantle that the Romans used. And there were other state factories, such as the Gynecea proper, under the official termed the comes sacrarum largitionum or comes largitionum. This is important because this official, as we were saying before, had actually control over lots of resources, not just these ones. So it was a person who had dramatic importance even for logistics, for rewards, as we have seen, for salaries, etc. So was a person who controlled a lot of money, and his office, its administration, were responsible for the effective working not just of the army but also of the state as a whole. We know Gynecea in this period in Italy, and they were located near the imperial seats or in traditional textile centers like Milan, Ravenna, and Rome, and also in Sicily, in Syracuse. And each factory was entrusted to a procurator, as we have seen, and defended by guards, right? So these centers were effectively under military administration, and were preserved as such and guarded as such. And naturally, what happens in the West here is, now we're not extremely specific here about the timeline, but you know that, in fact, under Justinian himself, the West was partially reconquered, and therefore there was all a Roman administration standing, telling the truth, in Ostrogothic Italy, etc. So basically most of this administration, but it remained at least after the war in that case, passed once again back into Roman hands. But there were other areas that were kind of a bit in between, like remaining Roman in function but not being under direct Roman control. For example, in Gallo-Roman society, it was followers of clerics and local duces, that is, local military commanders, that were essentially private people at that point, were equipped, right, at the expense of these leaders. Like, for example, the aristocratic bishop Sidonius Apollinaris died around 480, one of the most famous literary sources of the time. And you realize here, essentially, lay and ecclesiastical lords in the Gallo-Roman society had their own military retinues, and they provided for their own equipment. And the same Sidonius Apollinaris wrote, quote, about pointing out to his retainers, "You are well supplied with horses, armor, clothing." However, tradition remained strong in the army. as well. In Gaul, at the end of the 5th century, there were these local troops, the laity, and even though of Germanic origin, preserved their Roman identity, carrying their own standards in battle and retaining Roman dress in every particular, even as regards their shoes, right? And there wasn't much of a difference after all. Like even the same equipment, the armament, more broadly, were all often of Roman origin or influence, right? So, and especially in Gaul, we have to stress that a great deal of the Roman administration actually had remained intact, because Gaul, differently from other provinces, was not devastated by the migration. It was it was shattered, of course, but the local infrastructures were essentially intact, and this helped a lot, in fact, maintaining in Gaul that kind of military administration from which even the St. Carolingians would evolve eventually their own model, because of this greater supply and logistical organization that had somewhat survived and by transformed since Roman times, of great landowners who owned all the stuff privately. We have seen before these textile centers in the east, like in Antinopolis, essentially, Arsinoe, Panopolis, and the most famous Alexander in Egypt, Laodicea, that we met before. We have also pointed out the importance of the Silk Road in this, of the eastern caravans that brought these textiles that were very, very refined. And Laodicea too, not just Tyre, was famous for the manufacture of richly decorated fabric. The so-called Paragaudes Laodiceno. Procopius wrote that rural recruits, the Tirones, arrived in Constantinople with only a small tunic called the Kitoniskos, and recruits and serving soldiers received, theoretically for free, the clothing produced by state factories. Because even if we have seen how the differences in their equipment, at the same time it is perfectly likely that, especially in conditions of campaign, maybe not this one, but that there would be a more centralized and direct form of distribution. Like it's obvious that the tax system we have outlined at the beginning is relative just to kind of the regular administration, even just in peacetime. But it's obvious that if there was a major military expedition with a massive supply train, well, at that point everything was simpler. Like, of course, to get people, like the soldiery especially, already equipped with their own arms, but at the same time, during the campaign, naturally there were stocks and other weapons were carried and that were eventually repaid. Like, because if you're out there, I don't know, in the Danubian estuary, and where do you buy weapons from? Maybe you steal them from the local population, from the killed enemies, but that's still not the best supply area you can find. So that's also explained the need for this big establishments. Also, the imperial palace actually had this large amounts of stocks, because sometimes it came directly from there. And as we were saying before, like today we have problem of ammo, for example, not just the weapons. At this time, just with the weapon, you could do a lot. Of course, yeah, there were even arrows with you need to resupply in different ways. But let's say if you stock 10,000 spears, you can theoretically equip as many even just local militia, and that is not just a particularly small force, right? So this was a very important thing about the revolt of Nika, for example, that took place in Constantinople, where Belisarius and Theodora slaughtered all the rebellion from the circus clubs, let's say corporations that were threatening the same Justinian's reign at that point. So there were these problems of needing weapons close, right, at the very heart of power, because that could really make the difference, like in that case between, in fact, a revolution proper, right, and maintaining power. We have observed, in fact, as we were saying, the routine allowance to buy clothes from civilian soldiers was given to certain soldiers. We know that in 396 AD, the soldiers of Illyricum each received a solidus to buy their cloak. Second law of 423 AD records a tax collected in the provinces for the comes sacrarum largitionum. 5/6 of this revenue was distributed among the soldiers for the purchase of uniforms, and the rest went to the Geneshea for state production. That's where we get that proportion from. We've explained before. We know that in 594 AD, the emperor, because by the way, these laws were maintained effectively. These were laws that were emanated, here you see, from the Codex Theodosianum itself. The 396 and 423 ones, these were laws, were established at the time. As you know, the Justinian Code was just a reedition with certain minor changes of the Codex Theodosianum that had been composed previously. But we know later on that this system was modified further. For example, at the end of the 6th century, in 594, the Emperor Maurice planned to reduce cash payments by offsetting against wages the cost of state provisions of clothing and equipment, cutting the yearly allowance of the Comitatensis troops. And this caused a mess. They provoked a mutiny, settled only by generous concession to the mobilized soldiers and war orphans. This is meaningful because evidently, let's say, there was also the idea that this allowance could be essentially spent in different ways from the equipment, right? But it was a salary. And the problem is, so this is how to maintain the troops. The problem is that in theory, this had to be, for the cost of state provision of clothing. And this is very interesting because that's exactly how the stipendium, originally speaking, even in the early empire, was paid, right? It was a matter of saying, I give you this salary, and then you have to keep yourself, right? This is what actually with the Marian Reform happened. Right, this local, actually private establishments convention with the state at the time didn't quite exist. We know it from the generation after for the first time. I mean, probably, of course, they existed, but they hadn't probably been organized further, like it would happen, right? So these guys had one, but the imperial administration itself decides by the end of the 6th century, let's cut this pay because maybe it was deemed to be useless. Because, by the way, what about clothing, right? Of course, clothing is expensive, but what do you think people are going around with? Like, they all have their own clothing. They didn't go around naked. So, way or another, this maybe was seen as just a normal salary / tax in the way it was levied. That maybe they could do without at one point. But and by the way, this was attempted to be taken away from the Comitatensis troops, so the very best of the imperial professionals. So this, the mutiny in itself was very, very meaningful in this regard as well. But it shows that probably something was going bit off track compared to the previous needs, and even probably the same controls of the state on these military issues, right? Local populations under church administration were expected to contribute in kind. For example, in 588, the Bishop of Antioch organized the distribution of food, clothing and money to soldiers enrolled locally and those passing through the city. This is important because Antioch was one of the major, was capital of Syria, and it was one of the major, even metropolitic seats. Here, the Bishop of Antioch was a very powerful person, together with the one of Jerusalem and of Alexandria, of Egypt, and surely the one of Constantinople. But these were literally like the core, let's say. As you know, these areas were pretty rebellious. They didn't like very much Constantinopolitan rule, but I mean, locally speaking, these cities were kind of administered by the same ecclesiastical elite. So troops that had to be levied from there necessarily passed through the ecclesiastical administration, which in this case, as we've seen, paid literally for everything: food, clothing, and money. Not for the weaponry here, interestingly enough, though. We know that allied Arab clans on the eastern borders of the empire were also subsidized with Roman clothing and weapons, as well as food and cash. Right, so probably can imagine, even with these groups, that the Arabs at this point were settled by the Byzantines even within the imperial frontiers, some coming even from far south of Arabia, to work actually against the Sasanian threat that used Arabs on their own. It was the Lachemids and the Ghassanids, respectively, the Arab tribes participated side of the Romans and the Persians, and these troops essentially, I mean, there was a local administration where even some Roman soldiers, prober, administering here, but eventually these peoples were essentially ruling autonomously on these lands, and therefore there was a negotiation with them in terms of political and military organization that entailed the same pay of these means, right? So everything that also was available, right, to pay them, whether it was cash or actual clothing and and food, right? And the Emperor Tiberius II sent gifts for the Ghassanid Philarca Mondir, for example, including weapons, gold, silver horse harness, and bits, and splendid garments. So these are kind of like, this is not really local administration, this is like a diplomatic gift. And that's exactly what it is. Which means, by the way, that these troops had their own military organization, kind of worked by itself, and their traditional and kind of ethnical style of warfare was required there. But the elites needed to feel to be part of the empire. By the way, there were allies of the empire, but sometimes they even had their own. I mean, they were difficult to contain, and they got angered when even the imperial support failed, or lacked. So material and clothing were often acquired as war booty as well. Theophanes, for example, describes a victory over the Arabs in these terms: having occupied their camp, they captured a large number of Saracens, men, women, and children, and a lot of Roman prisoners, herds, silk, and clothing. The allied Ghassanian troops who sacked Haurim captured linen and wool garments, for example, as well. War booty may account for the large number of Sasanian silk garments found in the 6th and the 7th century. Egyptian graves as well. So you see here that this is a moment in which material culture is becoming dramatically poor, right? That the Byzantine Empire exhausted itself together with against the Persian one, and vice versa, essentially, and this favored the Islamic conquests by far, and so therefore even fighting over a cloth was a thing at the time. All right, and you do need that. I mean, you can't. You need to supply your soldiers properly as well. And in fact, clothing was also looted during internal Roman disputes. John of Ephesus mentions, among others, excubitores, Romans, which means soldiers, and scholastici, taking clothing and shoes from the common people during ecclesiastical disputes, right? Which were all over the place at the time, locally speaking. So it was really a clash over resources, so banal as clothing. And we also know that the spare army clothing, the imatia, was stored in the military baggage train together with weapons and supplies, right? So this was its natural location, even in the march. That has always been like that, but just in case, I mean, we know it, we say it. So this makes you understand. We will, as we will say at the beginning of the video, we will get into the various, Byzantine equipment and actual clothing in another occasion. But this is just for saying how important it was to provide for certain troops. I mean, you see what the problem is here is that there's a balance in between that is political, essentially, between the central rule and the local communities. Like, it's obvious the local communities could produce this stuff, but they only enough for what it was needed by themselves, because they had to work and survive, which was difficult at the time. The surplus was definitely low. Wars, the plague, all the things you can, in the famines, etc. Could have happened. Even such a few things could make the difference. Now, the problem for an army, for the central administration, is naturally to dispose of large amounts of this stuff in situations of emergency, like you have to leave for campaign, etc. And you need this stuff, because how do you cover your troops with? The problem is you need all this stuff in stocks, and stocks means that local communities struggle, but the central authority probably does even more, because the local person knows how very detailed, in great detail, how much can be spent about that, because they are the ones who manage more directly their resources. The state in itself actually burns resources tendentially more in proportion, because they have, if anything, to bring all of this together. Hence the reason, for example, why troops were paid by money instead than building up the practical distribution for clothing. And this saved a lot of resources, but not just from the side of the state, but from the side probably of the world community. And that's why currency is one of the greatest inventions of mankind, properly. And so it was difficult to, the more you demanded from local resources, the more discontent increased. But at the same time, you needed that. So it was particularly important. This time in history worked a lot through stocks and how much you could stock, but at a point that you needed to use that, right? And it was damn expensive, just like with weapons, with armor. We know in the 6th century, the Byzantine army that invaded Ostrogothic Italy started lacking even always more armor, actual metal armor. They used wooden armor, and because they didn't have it, things had become terribly expensive, and this system was progressively declining, contracting. So that's also why you find more regulation in late Roman times towards this stuff known, right? Because before it wasn't like that. Before it was easier to replenish this equipment. Later on it became much more difficult, and you can see this reflected in the same administration. And you really need the basics here to work well for the rest to work out successfully, and clothing is part of those basics, right? And you can't do without it. That's the real thing. That's the important thing. Together with food, and food more probably than anything else, because also weapons it's very expensive, but at least you can find it. Like You can't even take it from the enemy. You can, but food, for example, well, that's a real problem. That's where logistics is one of the single most important thing out there in campaign. But it also entails having reserves, having stocks, to which troops can be resupplied. And alright, so we have seen many examples of how this happened, even spoils of war, internal ravaging, and different ways of achieving this. We see the progressive decline with the eventual disappearance of the central establishments, right? Consider that you can naturally, like, these large establishments could work as long as there was a big empire, was well connected, that could take resources and access resources and levy more taxes thanks to the international trade, etc. When you lose half of your provinces with the Islamic invasions, you have other people threatening you. You lose a lot, like in not just the actual quantity you have lost, but much more, because you lose all those connections, and you can't sustain this large infrastructures anymore in the way you did before. So you also have to recur to different types of equipment and the different systems. And this entails further decentralization, which is essentially what the empire will do, especially later on during the 7th century, right? But we will see it step by step on another occasion. So we stop it here, and for now I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.